I had always been someone who preferred the quiet solitude of the wilderness to the chaos of city life. The smell of pine, the crispness of the air, and the sound of a distant stream were things that grounded me in ways nothing else could. So, when I decided to take a solo camping trip into the mountains, it wasn't out of recklessness or a desire to prove something. It was because I needed to escape, to push myself into being alone in a way that felt both challenging and peaceful. I didn't expect it to turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I arrived at the trailhead late in the morning. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few cars tucked away in the corners. The sign at the entrance warned of bears and sudden weather changes, but I had packed enough supplies: food, water, a first aid kit, extra clothing, and a sturdy tent to handle almost anything. The path started narrow and rocky, winding through dense forest, and I immediately felt the kind of serenity I had come for. The sunlight filtered through the tall pines in scattered rays, casting shadows that danced gently as the wind moved through the branches. The first few miles were uneventful, mostly spent observing birds, squirrels, and the occasional deer in the distance. I stopped at a small clearing near a stream to have lunch. The water was clear and cold, perfect for refilling my bottle, and the sound of it trickling over the rocks added a calming rhythm to the day. I had a small camp stove, so I made a quick meal of rice and canned beans. Everything felt normal, routine, almost idyllic. By the time I packed up my gear, the sun was already leaning toward the western horizon, giving the sky a warm orange glow. I planned to set up my camp about 2 miles further up the trail, near a ridge I had scouted on the map. As I walked, the forest grew denser, the shadows longer. The temperature began to drop quickly, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. There was a strange quietness here, more than I expected. The usual forest sounds seemed muted, as if I had stepped into a pocket where the world had been hushed. That feeling didn't bother me yet. I was alone, but I trusted myself and my preparations. I reached the ridge as dusk was approaching. It was higher ground with a slight clearing, ideal for pitching a tent. I chose a flat area, cleared it of sticks and stones, and set up my small, dome-style tent. I made a fire pit nearby, carefully surrounded by rocks, and laid out a small pile of wood I had gathered along the trail. Starting a fire took longer than usual. The wood was damp from the morning dew, but eventually, I had a small flame licking the edges of the pit, casting a warm glow over my campsite. The shadows of the trees flickered across the ground as the fire crackled, and I felt a deep sense of relief that I had made it this far. I ate a quick dinner, mostly protein bars and jerky, and filled my water bottle again. The sun had fully set now, leaving only the fading afterglow behind the mountains. The forest was dark, but the fire provided enough light to see my surroundings. I was careful to keep my food stored safely away from the tent. Bears weren't common this high up, but it was better to be cautious. I settled into my sleeping bag inside the tent, listening to the night. Owls hooted in the distance, and an occasional rustling in the underbrush reminded me that I wasn't entirely alone. Still, it was peaceful. I fell asleep feeling confident in my solitude and preparation. I woke hours later to a sound that immediately set my nerves on edge. It was faint at first, a snapping of a branch maybe 20 feet from the tent, but deliberate. My heart rate spiked, and I lay perfectly still, straining to hear. There it was again, closer this time, followed by a low, guttural growl that made my stomach drop. It didn't sound like any deer or mountain animal I had ever encountered. My first thought was a bear. I remembered the safety precautions I had read. Stay calm, make noise, don't run blindly, and keep yourself safe. I reached for my flashlight and the small bear spray I had brought, trying not to make sudden movements. The growling persisted, moving slowly around my tent. I couldn't see it, but I could hear it shifting, circling, testing me. The forest felt enormous and suffocating in the darkness. I realized that I hadn't fully assessed how exposed my position was on the ridge. The clearing was good for setting up a tent, but it left me isolated with no immediate escape. The fire had died down to embers, and the darkness felt absolute beyond that weak circle of light. I stayed motionless, listening. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds seemed to move away, fading gradually into the night. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure the creature could hear it. I considered packing up and leaving, but it was dark, and the trail back was steep and treacherous. Any movement now could make me more vulnerable. I decided to wait, silently, tense and alert, until the first signs of dawn. When the first light of morning filtered through the trees, I emerged from the tent to assess the situation. The fire pit was undisturbed, but around the perimeter of my clearing were deep, wide tracks I hadn't noticed before. They were clearly from a large animal, probably a bear, and they had come frighteningly close to my tent. I felt a mix of relief and fear. Relief that nothing had attacked, fear that the creature had been close enough to destroy everything in a moment if it wanted to. I packed my belongings carefully, making sure to keep noise to a minimum as I started down the trail. The hike back was nerve-wracking. Every rustle in the bushes, every bird taking off in alarm made my pulse race. I moved cautiously, keeping my bear spray accessible and a flashlight in hand. At one point, I spotted a large bear in the distance, feeding near a stream. It hadn't noticed me yet, but I didn't take chances. I circled wide, taking a longer route down, all the while feeling the crushing weight of being so small and unprotected in the wilderness. Every step was deliberate, careful, slow, until finally, after hours that felt endless, I reached the lower trail where other hikers were passing by. Seeing other people, hearing human voices, felt like a release of tension I didn't know I was holding. Once I reached my car, I sat inside for a long time, hands trembling, trying to comprehend the fear I had felt overnight. My backpack was heavy with supplies I hadn't used fully, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that I had survived, that I had made it through the darkness and the proximity of a predator that could have ended me in an instant. I drove away slowly, never feeling the need to rush, replaying every sound and shadow in my mind. That night, and for many nights afterward, I couldn't sleep properly. My imagination replayed the events, magnified in the safety of my room. But over time, the fear transformed into a deep respect for nature, for its unpredictability and its silent, indifferent power. I learned to prepare better, to understand animal behavior more thoroughly, and most importantly, to respect the wilderness in a way I hadn't before. That trip, terrifying as it was, gave me clarity about my limits and the balance between adventure and survival. I returned to camping eventually, but never in the same way. I never underestimated the wild again. I double-checked every piece of equipment, studied maps obsessively, and planned each trip with the awareness that nature doesn't bend to human desire. The fear I had faced alone in the mountains became a kind of guide, a reminder that survival often comes down to patience, observation, and respect for forces far larger than oneself. The trip that could have been my end became, in a strange way, a beginning. I carried that lesson with me, not as a tale of terror, but as proof that careful preparation and respect for the wilderness can turn fear into growth, and danger into understanding. I had always liked camping alone. There was a certain peace to it, a quiet that cut through the constant noise of daily life, a place where I could think and move at my own pace without someone else's schedule or needs interfering. I had been planning this trip for weeks, researching trails, checking maps, looking at weather reports, and making lists of all the supplies I might need. I wanted a deep woods experience, somewhere isolated, where I could feel truly immersed in nature, somewhere far from the hum of the city, far from the distant glow of streetlights, far from anyone who could hear me scream. I chose a section of forest in the northern part of the state. The area was known for its thick pine woods, steep inclines, and a large network of trails that were rarely used. On paper, it looked perfect, remote enough to avoid other campers, but not so isolated that emergency help would be impossible if I needed it. I packed my backpack carefully, triple-checking everything: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, first aid kit, fire-starting materials, knife, flashlight, map, compass, extra batteries, clothes, and a small stove. I left a note at home with my exact route, just in case, and set off early on a crisp October morning. The air was already cold, with a hint of frost in shaded areas, but the sun was bright and warm on my back as I hiked up the first mile of trail. The first few hours passed pleasantly. The forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of small animals and the whisper of the wind through the trees. The path wound along a ridge, offering brief glimpses of a valley far below, where the fall colors were turning the world into a patchwork of gold, red, and brown. I stopped often, not out of fatigue, but to look around and breathe in the smell of wet leaves, pine, and soil. I wanted to remember every detail of this trip. I had a journal in my pack, and I stopped mid-morning to jot a few notes, balancing the book on my knees while sitting on a large fallen log. By late afternoon, I found a clearing that looked like a perfect campsite. It was high on a small rise, with a flat area just large enough for my tent, surrounded by tall pines that would give some wind protection but still allow a view of the sky. The ground was mostly dirt with a few patches of grass, and there was a pile of rocks nearby that looked like it had been used for a fire before. I started setting up camp, staking my tent and arranging my supplies. As I worked, I noticed a few animal tracks in the dirt, but nothing alarming. Deer, probably, maybe a raccoon or a fox. Night fell faster than I expected. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the forest in shadows that seemed almost solid, stretching out in every direction. I built a fire, carefully stacking the logs to burn steadily without flaring out of control. I boiled water for my dinner and ate while staring into the flames. There was a strange comfort in the flickering light, but as the shadows stretched longer and the forest became colder and quieter, a faint unease began to creep in. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was normal, the isolation, the dark, the silence. I had done this before. I had handled nights alone in the woods. Around midnight, I was lying in my tent when I first heard it. A low, rustling sound, coming from somewhere beyond the clearing. At first, I told myself it was a deer, or maybe a raccoon digging through leaves, but the sound didn't stop. It moved slowly, careful, and deliberate, circling the edge of my clearing. My stomach tightened. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent, shining the beam outward. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating trees and shadows, but I saw nothing. The rustling continued, soft but persistent, just beyond the reach of the light. I sat frozen for a long time, straining my ears, listening to the faint sound of footsteps, or maybe claws, moving through the leaves. I remembered the knife in my bag and the bear spray strapped to my belt, but something in me told me this was not a normal animal. Animals made noise, but it wasn't methodical like this. The movements were calculated, circling, waiting. My mind raced, imagining the worst-case scenarios. A wild predator, a lost hiker with bad intentions, someone else who had found my camp. Every shadow seemed alive, every snap of a twig amplified in the dark. Hours passed in tense silence. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cold crept into my bones. I didn't sleep. I sat in the tent, flashlight in hand, scanning the darkness through the thin fabric walls. Every rustle, every crack of a branch, made my heart leap. Occasionally, the sound would stop for a long stretch, making me think the forest was silent again, only to start up once more, always just beyond the light. I realized I had made a mistake. I had set up camp in a place that could easily be approached without me seeing, a clearing with only one small path leading in. It wasn't visible on my map, but I could feel it instinctively. This wasn't a safe spot. By dawn, exhaustion had settled in, but I was too afraid to sleep. The first light of morning revealed more of the forest around me. The trees looked ordinary in the soft glow, but I noticed fresh prints in the dirt near the edge of the clearing, large, booted prints. Someone had been circling my camp in the night. My stomach sank. These weren't animal tracks. I checked my pack, making sure nothing was missing. Everything was exactly where I left it. Whoever had been here hadn't touched my stuff. But that didn't make me feel safer. It made me feel watched. I packed up quickly, trying not to make noise. Every branch that cracked underfoot, every rustle of leaves, made me tense. I moved deliberately, scanning the tree line as I went, keeping my fire extinguisher, knife, and bear spray ready. I didn't take the main trail. I moved through thicker brush, trying to stay out of sight. I didn't stop until I reached a narrow stream that would take me down into the valley. The hike down was slow and dangerous. Loose rocks, slippery moss, and the uneven trail made me fall twice, scraping my hands and knees. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone to emerge from the trees. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling of being followed never left me. My legs burned, my back ached, and my hands were cut and bruised from grabbing branches and rocks to steady myself. Yet the fear kept me moving, faster than I would have gone otherwise. Around mid-morning, I found an old logging road. It was rough and overgrown, but it led down to a main road that would eventually connect to civilization. My pace quickened. I walked for miles, keeping my eyes on the tree line, scanning for any signs of movement. The forest seemed ordinary again, but I didn't trust it. Every shadow, every sound of birds or small animals made me tense. Finally, late in the afternoon, I emerged from the trees onto the edge of a highway. The sight of cars, even far below me, gave me an almost absurd relief. I knew I was safe for the first time in almost 2 days. I trudged down the side road until I found a gas station and collapsed in the parking lot, exhausted, trembling, and shaking. I called a friend to come get me. I didn't tell them everything, only that I needed to leave immediately. That night, I slept in a hotel, fully clothed with the lights on, and I barely moved all night. I thought about what had happened, about the footprints, the circling sounds, the feeling of being watched. I thought about how lucky I had been that whoever or whatever it was had left without approaching me more closely. I realized that nature wasn't the only danger out there. Humans could be just as predatory, and sometimes more dangerous because they understood fear. In the days that followed, I examined my gear, retraced my route on maps, and tried to understand what had happened. I noticed things I had missed. A tree with deep scratches on the bark, a flattened patch of grass that suggested someone had crouched there, listening or watching. I filed a report with the ranger station. They said they would investigate, though it was unclear how much they could do. I never returned to that campsite. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I hike alone or set up camp in a quiet clearing. The forest can be beautiful, it can be peaceful, but it can also be dangerous in ways you never anticipate. That trip taught me more than I ever expected. I learned to respect the isolation, to understand that silence can be as threatening as any roar, and that preparation is never just about equipment. It's about awareness, caution, and humility. I kept camping after that, but differently. I never again set up camp without first observing the surrounding area for signs of other humans. I never again ignored the small, uneasy feelings that creep into your mind when something isn't right. And I always left a clear plan with someone, no matter how safe the area seemed. The forest hasn't stopped being beautiful. I still hike, still set up tents, still light fires and boil water in quiet clearings. But I am always alert, always aware. The memory of those circling footsteps at night, the cold, calculated sound in the dark, is ingrained in me. It changed me, sharpened me, made me a camper who understands that the wilderness is not just about trees and animals. It's about knowing that danger can be human, silent, and patient, waiting for the smallest lapse in judgment. And I survived. I survived because I stayed calm when panic wanted to take over. I survived because I moved deliberately and observed constantly. I survived because I respected both the forest and the humans who can move through it unseen. That clarity, that carefulness, is what keeps me alive every time I set out into the woods now. I walk differently, I see differently, and I feel differently. I know that beauty and danger live side by side in the forest, and I have learned how to navigate both. The story could have ended in disaster. Didn't. But I will never forget the fear, the tension, and the knowledge that I had been truly alone in the forest, and not entirely alone in the sense I had thought. The experience left scars, not just physical, but mental, sharpening me and reminding me that the wilderness is a place where respect, preparation, and attention can make the difference between life and death. I learned that night, and every night since, that camping alone is not just an escape. It is a test. And I survived it whole, wary, and infinitely more aware of the world around me. had always thought of myself as someone who could handle the outdoors. I liked the quiet of the forest, the way the wind moved through the trees, and the way the sun hit the leaves in the morning. I liked the feeling of being completely alone, with only the sounds of nature around me. It was a kind of peace I could never find in the city, and it had become a small obsession. That's why I had decided, at the last minute, to go camping alone in the backcountry of the national forest. I didn't want to go far, just a few miles from the nearest trailhead, but far enough that no one would stumble across me by accident. I wanted silence, and I was willing to be completely isolated to get it. The day I left, the weather was clear, colder than I had expected for the season. I carried a large backpack, heavier than it should have been, but I insisted on bringing everything I thought I might need. A tent, a sleeping bag rated for low temperatures, a small stove, food for 3 days, extra clothing, a first aid kit, a water filter, matches, a flashlight, and a headlamp with extra batteries. I also carried a small hatchet and a knife, because I liked the idea of being prepared for anything. My plan was simple. Hike in, set up camp near a small stream I had found on a map, spend 2 nights alone, and hike back out. It seemed safe, straightforward, and easy. I started hiking around mid-morning. The trailhead was quiet, as I had expected. The path was narrow, rocky in places, with roots that twisted across the dirt, forcing me to watch every step. I walked quickly, enjoying the sound of my boots crushing the dry leaves and twigs underfoot. As I walked deeper into the forest, the sun climbed higher, and I noticed how silent it was. Birds chirped occasionally, but there were no other sounds of humans. No cars in the distance, no voices, nothing. It was the kind of silence that makes every snap of a branch feel loud. I liked it at first. After about 2 hours of hiking, I reached the small stream I had seen on the map. It was narrower than I expected, but the water ran clear over smooth stones. I followed it for a short while, looking for a flat spot to set up camp. I wanted a place that was safe but also a little elevated, in case it rained. Eventually, I found a clearing. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, surrounded by tall pines, and the stream curved around the edge. Perfect, I thought. I set down my pack and started setting up my tent. By the time the tent was ready, it was late afternoon. I collected some dry wood and small branches to make a fire, careful to choose pieces that wouldn't smolder and produce too much smoke. I cleared a small circle of leaves and dirt, built a small pile of kindling, and lit it with matches. Flames licked the wood warm and steady. I sat on a flat rock nearby, watching the fire, feeling the heat against my skin as the sun began to sink lower in the sky. The forest around me grew darker, the shadows stretching long between the trees. Everything felt calm, and I felt proud of myself for making it this far alone. Night came quickly. The air grew cold, biting against my cheeks, and I zipped myself into the sleeping bag after cooking a small meal on my stove. The stream gurgled quietly beside me, and the fire crackled in the darkness. I felt completely safe, completely alone, and completely in control. That feeling didn't last. Around midnight, I woke to a sound that made my stomach tighten. First, I thought it was the wind. The trees were moving, branches scraping against one another, producing a scratching, groaning noise. But then I realized the sound wasn't coming from the trees. It was coming from the ground around my tent. A soft, repeated crunching, like someone walking carefully but deliberately on dry leaves. My heart started beating faster. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon, but it was too precise, too deliberate. The steps moved closer, stopping and starting, circling the tent. My mind raced. I had a knife in the tent and the hatchet outside, but I didn't want to go out and check. The sound continued for what felt like hours. I stayed perfectly still, listening, trying to control my breathing. At one point, I thought I heard a low, muffled groan, but I couldn't be sure. I forced myself to focus on the fire, which had burned low, and the stream, which was still quietly gurgling. My hands shook as I gripped the knife, ready to defend myself if necessary. Eventually, the footsteps moved away. I waited, every sense alert, until I thought it was safe enough to look outside. I unzipped the tent just a little and peered out. The clearing was empty, bathed in moonlight. Nothing. I forced myself to calm down, to think rationally. Animals can make noise. Maybe it was just one of them. Maybe it wasn't anything. But the next morning, I discovered that my carefully stacked firewood had been disturbed. Pieces were scattered around, some broken. I knew no deer or raccoon would have done that. My stomach sank. Something had been there, close enough to my tent to inspect my firewood, and it hadn't been an animal. The second day was tense. I stayed near the tent most of the time, too nervous to wander far. I collected firewood in small batches, always glancing over my shoulder, always alert to the slightest noise. The forest, which had felt peaceful the day before, now felt oppressive. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, set my nerves on edge. I checked my supplies constantly, making sure my food was safe, my knife close, my hatchet within reach. By late afternoon, I realized I needed water. I filled my bottle from the stream and started filtering it. As I knelt by the bank, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the soft soil along the edge of the stream, much larger than mine, with deep impressions. They weren't animal tracks. They were human. I froze. The prints were fresh, probably made that same night. Whoever or whatever had circled my tent had come from here. My heart raced as I tried to consider my options. I could pack up and leave immediately, but it was late in the day, and hiking in the dark would be dangerous. I decided to wait, but I knew I couldn't stay still forever. That night was worse than the first. The footsteps returned, circling my tent, sometimes pausing, sometimes retreating, always deliberate. I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire, knife and hatchet in hand, listening to every sound. Once, I thought I heard someone whisper my name. Couldn't be sure. The forest played tricks on the mind at night, and I tried to convince myself it was just the wind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I knew someone had been following me, watching me, waiting. Morning came slowly. I was exhausted, but I couldn't stay. I packed my tent and supplies as quickly and quietly as possible. I avoided the stream, worried about leaving tracks. I chose a different path back, hoping it would be safer, hoping it would lead me to the main trailhead. The forest felt different in daylight, less threatening, but I was still tense. Every sound made me jump, every shadow made me wary. By midday, I had left the clearing far behind. The trail was familiar now, marked by signs and beaten earth. I kept my pace steady, focusing on reaching the trailhead. I felt relief with every step, but also lingering fear, knowing that someone had been close enough to watch me, that I had no idea who they were or why they had been there. Finally, I emerged from the forest onto the dirt road leading to the parking area. Cars were parked, and people walked along the road, laughing and talking. I felt a surge of relief so strong it made me dizzy. I kept walking until I reached my car, my backpack heavy on my shoulders, my hands shaking. I locked the doors and sat inside for a long time, just breathing. I didn't feel safe until I drove away, leaving the forest behind. After I got home, I reported what happened to the ranger station. They took my report seriously, noting the footprints and disturbed firewood. Rangers went to the area, and over the next week, they found evidence that someone had been living rough in that part of the forest. They didn't find the person, but there were campsites, makeshift shelters, and signs that the individual had been observing hikers and campers. I realized I had been lucky, extremely lucky. If I had been slower, if I had made more noise, if I had chosen a different spot, the outcome could have been very different. I never went back to that part of the forest. I still go camping, but I am much more careful now. I stick to well-traveled trails, camp in designated areas, and always let someone know exactly where I am going. I learned that being alone in the forest isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it's dangerous, and sometimes the quiet hides more than just nature. Even now, months later, I still remember the sound of the footsteps circling my tent that night. I remember the way the shadows moved, the way the forest seemed to watch me. I know I was lucky to make it out without anyone seeing me, without any real harm. But I also know that the forest doesn't forgive mistakes. It doesn't care about luck. and I know I will never forget that night, because it changed the way I see the outdoors forever. I had been planning this trip for months. I needed to get away from everything. My work, the city, even people. I packed my car with the bare minimum. A tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, some canned food, a couple of liters of water, a first aid kit, and a flashlight. I drove for hours, taking back roads and winding through forests until I reached a place marked on my map as public camping area. It wasn't a big park or a popular site. It was one of those small, isolated spots that felt forgotten, overgrown, and wild. The sun was low in the sky when I arrived, brushing the tops of the trees with gold. I pulled off the road onto a narrow dirt track, the tires crunching over loose stones. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, clean and sharp. I parked near a clearing surrounded by dense forest. There were no other cars, no signs of people, just the distant sound of birds and an occasional rustle of leaves. I felt a thrill. This was exactly the kind of isolation I wanted. I began scouting a spot for my tent. I wanted it flat and slightly elevated so any rain wouldn't flood it. The ground was uneven in many places, covered with fallen branches and patches of moss, but I found a clearing just big enough for my tent. It was partially shielded by a line of trees, which offered some privacy from the narrow path but still left me an open view of the sky. I cleared rocks and sticks as best I could and pitched my tent. I always double-checked the stakes and guy lines, making sure it was secure. The sun was almost gone by the time I started a small fire. I had brought some dry wood from home, knowing that firewood in remote areas could be damp. I arranged the logs carefully, built a teepee shape, and struck a match. Smoke curled upward, the fire crackling to life. I sat back for a moment, listening. The forest was quiet now, darker, with long shadows stretching from the trees. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of wet leaves and distant soil. I could hear the soft hum of insects beginning their night patrol. I cooked a small meal, heating canned beans and a tin of tuna over the fire. Eating in the silence felt almost strange at first. There were no cars, no voices, nothing but the wind and the occasional snapping twig. I noticed how small sounds were amplified in the stillness, like the soft rustle of a squirrel in the underbrush or the distant call of a bird settling for the night. Once I finished eating, I cleaned up, putting everything away carefully, knowing that food left out could attract animals. I checked my flashlight and set it on my backpack just outside the tent flap. Night fell fully, and the forest seemed to change. Darkness isn't just an absence of light. It has weight and depth. Shadows stretched and twisted in the corners of my vision. Every small sound, leaves brushing, a branch falling, the scurry of something on the forest floor, felt sharper, closer. I laid down in my sleeping bag, trying to focus on breathing evenly, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone. I told myself it was just my imagination, the way isolation messes with your mind. I had camped alone before, and it had always been fine. This time felt different, though. The darkness here felt thicker, heavier. Around midnight, I woke to a sound that froze me. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible over the rustling of leaves. Then it became clearer. A low, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the forest floor. My heart started pounding. I tried to convince myself it was a fallen branch or a small animal. But the sound was deliberate, measured, too heavy for a raccoon or a deer. It moved slowly, rhythmically, getting closer to my tent. I stayed still, holding my breath, listening. My flashlight was just within reach. I considered looking outside, but my instincts told me to stay quiet. The sound paused, then moved again, closer this time. I could hear twigs snapping under the weight, a soft, dragging friction on the dirt. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? A wild animal? Or maybe someone else in the woods. I hadn't seen anyone for hours, and there was no way a stranger could have followed me here unnoticed. But the idea gnawed at me. I stayed as still as possible, keeping the flap of my tent zipped. My breathing was shallow, every small noise exaggerated in the stillness. Then came another sound, a low growl, barely audible, but it was real. My blood ran cold. I had heard bears in the wild before, read about them, and knew this sounded close. I reached slowly for the can of bear spray I always carried, my hand trembling. I had planned for emergencies, but nothing could have prepared me for the sensation of hearing a large predator moving around your sleeping area in the dead of night. The fire I had left burning had mostly died down, leaving a few smoldering embers. I realized I had made a mistake. I should have kept more light and noise around. The movement stopped for a long time. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I tried to remember my training. Make yourself big, make noise, don't run blindly. But I was trapped in a tent, and even though I knew the bear couldn't just reach me instantly, I felt completely exposed. I thought about my pack, my car, how far away any help would be. I could see the faint moonlight filtering through the trees, and every shadow looked like it could be hiding something huge. Then it moved again, closer to the fire remnants. I heard a crunch of leaves and the faint scent of something musky, like animal fur mixed with wet soil. I realized it was testing me, trying to see if I was a threat or prey. My hands shook as I gripped the bear spray, my mind racing through every option. I remembered reading that staying still and quiet sometimes works better than sudden movements. I tried to control my breathing, whispering to myself that it would pass, that the bear would leave if it didn't see food. Minutes stretched like hours. I barely dared to blink. Every time a twig snapped, I flinched, expecting to see a massive shape towering over me. I thought about leaving, running to the car, but I knew that would be dangerous. A sudden movement outside a tent is the exact thing that triggers a bear to attack. I had to wait. I had to be calm. I had to survive. Finally, I heard the sound recede, slowly moving back into the darkness. I stayed in that position for what felt like forever, listening, straining to hear every detail. The forest slowly returned to its normal night sounds. Insects, wind, distant animal calls, but I didn't relax completely. My heart was still racing. I stayed awake until the first hint of dawn, eyes glued to the flap of the tent, ready to react if anything moved. When the sun finally began to rise, the forest transformed again. Light filtered through the trees, shadows retreated, and the sounds of birds and rustling leaves returned to normal. I cautiously unzipped the tent, keeping my eyes peeled. The fire pit was undisturbed except for a few fallen embers, and there were deep scratches on the soil around it. It was clear that something had come close, something large, maybe a bear. I felt a mix of relief and adrenaline. I packed my things slowly, checking every corner of my campsite for signs of further danger. I moved deliberately, keeping my eyes and ears alert. When I finally stepped back onto the dirt road and started my car, I felt the tension in my body start to unwind. I didn't leave immediately, though. I drove slowly, scanning the tree line, making sure nothing was following. The experience changed how I viewed the wilderness. I had underestimated how alive and unpredictable it could be. I realized that even careful preparation doesn't make you invulnerable, and that respect for the environment and the animals in it is crucial. That day, I learned that fear is not just in your mind. It is real, and it commands caution. By the time I reached the main road, sunlight was fully illuminating the forest. I felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. I had survived a night alone with a predator in one of the most isolated camping spots I had ever chosen. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a deep, steady gratitude for life and safety. I parked in a small rest area, stretched, and took a long drink of water. The memory of the night would stay with me, sharp and vivid, but I also felt empowered, knowing I had managed to stay calm, follow my instincts, and survive against something far more powerful than myself. I returned home later that day, tired but safe, and made a new decision. I would continue camping, but differently. I would research more, carry more safeguards, and always respect the wild completely. That night in the forest taught me that survival is about patience, observation, and knowing your limits. It taught me that fear is a tool, not an enemy, and that preparation can mean the difference between life and death. I had faced real danger and come through it, and though the memory lingered, I knew I had emerged stronger, more cautious, and more alive than ever before. I had always thought of myself as someone who could handle the outdoors. I had gone on day hikes, a few overnight trips, and even a weekend backpacking trip once, where I learned the hard way that I was not as prepared as I thought. But nothing I had done before could have prepared me for the camping trip I planned that summer, deep in the northern forests of my state. The area was remote, far from roads and any sort of cell signal. I wanted isolation, solitude, a chance to be fully immersed in the wilderness. I told myself it would be peaceful, a chance to reconnect with nature. I had no idea it would become the most terrifying experience of my life. I arrived late in the morning, after a long drive on narrow country roads that seemed to twist endlessly through the thick forest. The sun was bright, but the air was cool and damp, carrying that earthy scent of pine and moss that always makes me feel like I'm truly away from the city. I parked on a small dirt clearing at the edge of the trailhead. There was a small, rickety sign that warned visitors to take caution, mostly about wildlife, but I didn't think much of it. I slung my backpack over my shoulders and started hiking in. My pack was heavy, carrying a tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a few survival tools I insisted on bringing despite my confidence that I wouldn't need them. I had a basic first aid kit, a sturdy knife, a flashlight, and a small portable stove. I didn't want to overpack, but I wanted to be prepared for a couple of nights in the wild. The trail was narrow and uneven, and I had to duck under low branches and step over roots. I kept my pace steady, taking in the dense forest around me. Birds called sporadically, and I occasionally caught glimpses of small animals darting between the trees. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The sound of the wind moving through the canopy and the crunch of leaves beneath my boots were the only noises. I noticed how every little sound seemed amplified, the rustling of a squirrel in the brush, the distant snap of a branch. The isolation was thrilling at first, a kind of meditative silence I had craved, but as I walked further, a subtle tension started to creep in. I realized just how alone I was. No other hikers, no vehicles, no voices, just me and the forest. By mid-afternoon, I found a spot that seemed perfect for camping. It was a small clearing, slightly elevated, with a few dead logs that could serve as seats. The ground was flat and covered with soft pine needles. A small stream ran nearby, which was perfect for water, but not too close to risk flooding if it rained. I unpacked my gear and started setting up my tent, careful to make sure it was secure and level. I built a small fire pit from surrounding rocks and gathered enough firewood for the night. I was meticulous about making sure everything was organized. I had learned from past mistakes that disorganization in the wild can be dangerous. As the sun began to lower in the sky, I felt a wave of calm. I had done all the preparations, and soon I would have a quiet night with the crackling of my fire and the hum of the forest around me. But as I stacked the last pieces of firewood, I noticed something odd. There were fresh tracks near the stream. At first, I thought they were deer, but they were much larger and heavier, and the spacing suggested a human or a large animal walking on two legs. My first instinct was to ignore it, tell myself I was overthinking, but my gut said otherwise. I scanned the area carefully. Nothing moved, nothing stirred. The forest seemed perfectly still. I returned to my camp and tried to shake off the unease. I cooked a small meal over the fire, ate slowly, and drank some water. The sun was almost gone, and the shadows between the trees grew long and dark. I decided to set up my tent and settle in for the night. I kept my knife close, and I positioned my flashlight within easy reach. The first few hours were quiet, almost serene, as I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the night sounds. The distant hoot of an owl, the trickle of the stream, the rustle of leaves in the wind. But then I heard it, a faint snapping of twigs somewhere beyond the clearing. My heart rate picked up instantly. I froze, listening intently. The sound stopped, then a few seconds later it came again, closer this time. It was deliberate, slow, like someone or something was moving carefully but watching me. I forced myself to stay calm. Could have been an animal. Maybe a deer, maybe a bear, maybe a raccoon. But the pacing didn't feel natural. It didn't feel random. I tried to rationalize. telling myself I had no real evidence. But I couldn't ignore the cold not forming in my stomach. I decided to wait to see if it would go away. The minutes stretched on, and each small sound made me tense. The forest, once inviting, now felt like it was closing in on me. Every shadow seemed exaggerated, every rustle a potential threat. Hours passed, and I struggled to sleep, constantly waking at every crack and shift. I noticed another thing. My fire seemed smaller, the logs I had stacked for the night slightly rearranged. My mind raced. I had been careful to set it up securely. No wind could have moved them that precisely. Someone had been near my camp while I was lying in my tent. Panic set in. I had a choice. Stay in the tent and risk a close encounter, or try to leave under cover of darkness, navigating the unfamiliar forest in near-complete darkness. I weighed my options quickly. Leaving meant I could get lost, but staying meant I had an unknown person or animal so close I couldn't see them. I decided to wait until early dawn. Night is less predictable, I told myself. I kept my knife in my hand and listened. As the first light of morning touched the trees, I cautiously peeked outside. The clearing seemed empty, but the firewood had been disturbed further. Footprints surrounded my camp, unmistakably human. I felt a chill unlike anything I had ever experienced. Someone had been here all night, observing me, and I had no idea if they were still nearby. I packed everything as quietly as possible, keeping my senses alert to every movement. Each crack of a branch, each rustle of leaves set me on edge. My pace increased as I tried to move calmly but quickly, navigating the trail I had hiked in on. As I progressed, I noticed fresh footprints in the dirt trail, not mine. I hadn't seen another person the day before, but now it was clear. Someone had been following me, keeping pace but careful not to reveal themselves. Fear surged through me, but I forced myself to think clearly. I had a map, a compass, and enough supplies to survive for the day if necessary. I also had a small whistle and a flare in case of emergency. I decided to make my way to a more open area, closer to the main trail where I might encounter other hikers or at least be visible. I moved carefully, avoiding sudden noises, and tried to mask my tracks by walking off the trail whenever possible. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher. The footprints continued intermittently, sometimes disappearing, then reappearing, as if whoever it was deliberately avoiding direct contact. My mind imagined every scenario, each one worse than the last. What if they were armed? What if they had malicious intent? The forest, so beautiful in daylight, now seemed like a labyrinth designed to trap me. I pushed myself harder, focusing on survival, navigating by landmarks I had noted on my map the day before. I realized that panic would be my enemy. Slow, deliberate movements, careful attention to the environment, and keeping calm were my best tools. By late afternoon, I reached a ridge overlooking a wide river valley. The view was stunning. The river glimmered under the sun, and the forest stretched endlessly. But I didn't have time to appreciate it. I needed to find a safer spot to rest and reassess. I noticed a small dirt road leading away from the valley, a faint but clear trail that could lead me toward civilization. I headed toward it, making careful, calculated movements, constantly checking behind me. My pace quickened when I felt the instinctual need to put as much distance as possible between myself and the unknown follower. I emerged from the forest onto the dirt road as the sun began to dip toward the horizon. I could see a distant car parked near a trailhead, and I felt a surge of relief. The fear that had gripped me for more than a day began to ease, though I remained vigilant. I approached the parked car cautiously, scanning the surrounding area. There was no sign of anyone else. I quickly moved to the car, unlocked it, and got inside. I started the engine and drove slowly down the road, keeping an eye on the tree line. I had the feeling I was still being watched, but I knew that I was moving towards safety. By nightfall, I reached a small town several miles away. I parked at a convenience store, locked the doors, and called the police to report what had happened. I described the location of my campsite, the footprints, and the trail of the unknown person who had been following me. The officer on the line assured me they would send someone to investigate, and I waited in my car until they arrived, too shaken to consider leaving. When they came, they confirmed my fears. There had been reports of a person lurking in the woods, targeting solo campers. They said I had narrowly avoided a potentially dangerous situation. The experience left me shaken for weeks. I couldn't forget the sound of twigs snapping in the dark, the rearranged firewood, or the footprints surrounding my tent. But I also learned something important. Preparation, awareness, and calm thinking are critical in situations where fear can cloud judgment. I had survived not because of luck, but because I stayed alert, made deliberate choices, and trusted my instincts. Over time, I returned to hiking and camping, but I never again ventured so far into the wilderness alone without thorough planning, without letting someone know exactly where I was going, and without understanding that danger in the wild is not always animals, it is sometimes other humans. Looking back, I understand that the forest had not changed. It was still serene, still beautiful, but I had glimpsed its other side, the side where isolation and vulnerability can become terrifying. And I knew, deep down, that I had survived because I respected that reality and acted accordingly. The clarity of that lesson, the rawness of fear, and the relief of making it out alive have stayed with me ever since. It was a clear, hard-earned ending. I survived, I learned, and I was changed forever. I remember the morning I left for that camping trip as though it was yesterday, even though it has been years. I packed my old backpack with meticulous care, making sure I had everything I thought I might need. A tent that had seen better days but still stood strong. A sleeping bag thick enough to handle cold nights. A small stove, fuel, enough food for 3 days, a first aid kit, extra socks, a flashlight with spare batteries, a map of the area, and a compass. I left my phone on purpose, wanting this trip to be a real escape from the noise of life, from the constant buzzing of notifications and the weight of deadlines. I wanted to be alone with the forest, with the trees, with the dirt under my boots, with the river and the wind. I wanted to feel small again, like I belonged to the earth in a way that no office or city could ever give me. The drive to the trailhead took longer than I expected. The road narrowed and twisted through hills that grew taller the further I went. The trees became thicker, their trunks dark and slick with moss. I remember the smell, sharp and sweet in the cold air, a mixture of wet earth, decaying leaves, and pine. By the time I parked my car, the sun was already lowering, spilling gold across the forest floor. I took a deep breath and hoisted my pack over my shoulders. It was heavy, but the weight was familiar. It reminded me that I was prepared, that I could handle what was coming, whatever it might be. I set off down the trail, boots crunching on fallen leaves, the sound echoing in the stillness of the forest. The first mile was easy, the path wide and worn. Birds called from above, squirrels scurried across the underbrush, and occasionally a deer would dart between the trees, white tail flashing. The forest felt alive but welcoming. I walked for hours, following the trail, climbing hills, crossing small creeks on makeshift bridges of rocks. I took my time, stopping to drink water, to catch my breath, to look at the patterns in the bark of trees, the way sunlight glinted off leaves. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing that seemed perfect for a campsite. A flat patch of ground, bordered by dense trees, with a small stream running nearby. I set down my pack and took a moment to just stand there, breathing, feeling the wind on my face. The forest was quiet here, not the kind of quiet that is peaceful, but the kind of quiet that hums with a tension you only notice when the world slows down enough to hear it. I didn't mind it. I liked it. I pitched my tent carefully, securing it against the uneven ground, making sure the stakes were deep. Then I set up my small stove, unpacked some food, and sat by the stream, letting the water run over my fingers. The sun dropped lower, the shadows lengthening and darkening, until the sky became a fading wash of purple and orange. I ate a simple meal of rice and beans, washing it down with water from my canteen. The stars came out gradually, pale at first, then sharp and bright, the Milky Way stretching across the sky like a pale ribbon. I remember feeling a profound sense of isolation, of being completely alone in the world, and it was intoxicating. The first night was quiet. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant cry of a bird, the babble of the stream. But as the hours passed, I noticed something else. Small sounds at first, almost imperceptible. A snapping of a twig here, a soft rustle there. My mind told me it was nothing, that it was just animals moving in the dark. But my body tensed anyway, every muscle alert. I remembered the advice I had read in countless camping guides. Always be aware of your surroundings. Always respect the forest. By the second night, the feeling of unease had grown. I had hiked further in the morning, following a faint trail that the map marked but the ground barely showed. The forest grew denser, the trees older and closer together, the underbrush thick and wet. My boots became caked with mud, my clothes damp with sweat and water from brushing past ferns. I found another small clearing to camp, smaller than the first, more enclosed by trees. I set up my tent quickly, more out of necessity than choice, and cooked a simple dinner again, using the dim light of the fading day. It was after the sun disappeared completely that I started hearing it. The footsteps. At first, I convinced myself it was an animal. Bears, deer, maybe a coyote. But the sound didn't match. It was deliberate, slow, uneven, and it seemed to circle my campsite. I held my breath, straining to hear. My flashlight was inside the tent, out of reach, and I didn't want to leave the relative safety of the nylon walls. The footsteps stopped, then a pause, then a snap. Something heavy moved through the underbrush. My stomach tightened, my mind raced. I stayed awake most of that night, listening, tense, imagining all sorts of scenarios. But as dawn broke, the forest seemed normal again. Birds sang, the stream gurgled, and the morning mist hung in the trees. I told myself I had imagined it, that it was my mind playing tricks, that it was just the forest settling in the early morning. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next day, I decided to follow the stream upstream, hoping to find a better campsite, maybe even a small waterfall I had seen marked on the map. The walk was difficult. The ground was uneven, roots and rocks hidden under leaves, water crossing paths at unexpected points. I slipped once and fell into a shallow pool, wetting my clothes and boots. I laughed at myself, but the laughter was hollow. I felt a persistent awareness that something might be watching, following, waiting. By late afternoon, I found a place that seemed suitable. A larger clearing with rocks that could serve as a natural windbreak. I pitched my tent, hung my pack on a branch to keep it off the damp ground, and gathered firewood. The sun dropped quickly, the shadows growing long. I cooked dinner and ate slowly, listening for any unusual sounds. The footsteps didn't come back, but other things did. Rustling, branches breaking, low sounds that I couldn't identify. I told myself it was just deer or maybe raccoons, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Night came faster here. The clearing was surrounded by tall, dense trees, and the darkness felt almost physical, pressing against the edges of my tent. I lay in my sleeping bag, heart racing, waiting for sleep. The sounds came again. A branch snapping, leaves rustling, something moving closer. I didn't dare leave the tent. My flashlight was inside, under my sleeping bag. I considered it, but my hands were shaking. Then I heard it. A crunch, deliberate, heavy, moving closer and closer. My mind raced with possibilities. Human footsteps were different from animal ones. They have a weight, a pattern. This was not random. Someone or something was out there. I felt a wave of panic. My survival instincts kicked in. I grabbed my flashlight, shone it toward the sound. Nothing. Just the trees, the shadows, the dark. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath. Then the sound started moving away, slowly, deliberately. My body relaxed slightly, but I didn't sleep. Not a single minute. Morning came and I packed quickly. I decided to leave the area entirely, take the nearest trail back to the road. The walk was tense. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move with purpose. I was hyper-aware, alert, constantly scanning. Hours later, I reached the trailhead, exhausted, muddy, sore, but relieved. My car was exactly where I had left it. No one was around. No one had been there. I drove home in silence, thinking about the forest, about the feeling of being followed, about how quickly the sense of safety can disappear in a place that seems so calm and welcoming. I knew the forest had been no different than it had always been. It was me, alone, unprepared for how vulnerable solitude could make a person feel. I realized that fear is not always about danger, but about awareness, about being aware of how small and fragile we are in the world. Weeks later, I returned to the forest, but only on day hikes, never overnight again. I respected it differently, understanding that nature does not follow our rules, that it can be unpredictable, that it can make us feel powerless. That trip taught me a lot about preparation, about awareness, about self-reliance. I double-checked my supplies, planned my routes carefully, and always carried extra tools, just in case. But more than anything, I learned about fear and resilience. I learned that being alone is both beautiful and dangerous, and that respect for the natural world is the only way to truly stay safe in it. Years later, when I camp again, I remember that trip with a clarity that surprises me. I remember the sounds, the smells, the weight of the pack on my back, the way the forest seemed to shift in the darkness. I also remember the relief of reaching safety, the calm that followed, the lessons that stayed with me. And every time I enter the woods, I carry that memory, that awareness, that respect, knowing that the forest is not a fairy tale, that it does not bend to our will, and that real fear is not about monsters. It is about understanding your own limits and how careful you must be when you are truly alone in the wild. I had been planning this trip for months. The idea was simple. Leave the city behind for a long weekend, find a remote spot in the mountains, and just be alone with nature. I had packed carefully, double-checked everything, and mentally prepared myself for a few days of complete isolation. I had done some hiking before, but I had never camped this far off the grid, and part of me was excited by that. I knew I could handle myself, or at least I thought I could. The drive to the trailhead was long, winding through miles of narrow roads bordered by thick forest. As the city faded behind me, the air changed. It was cooler, cleaner, and carried a scent of damp pine and earth. By the time I parked, the sun was low, brushing the mountain ridges with a golden light that made the trees glow. I grabbed my pack, heavier than I wanted it to be, and started down the trail. The path was rough, uneven in places with rocks and roots that threatened to trip me with every step. I moved slowly, careful not to hurt myself, and as I descended into the valley, the forest closed in around me. The trees were tall, old, and thick, and the sunlight barely penetrated the canopy. It was peaceful in a way that made the city feel impossibly loud and distant. Birds chirped here and there, and a squirrel darted across my path at one point, freezing for a moment before disappearing into the underbrush. I hiked for about 3 hours before finding a small clearing near a stream. The spot was perfect, flat, sheltered from wind by surrounding trees, with the soft sound of water running over rocks. I dropped my pack and sat down to catch my breath, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. This was the kind of place where time slowed down, where every little sound seemed amplified, and where the ordinary stresses of life melted away. I set up my tent, securing it tightly to the ground, and gathered firewood from the surrounding forest. I made sure to choose dry pieces of wood, though even the driest twigs had a faint dampness from the earlier rain. Starting a fire wasn't easy, and it took me a solid half-hour of rubbing matches, arranging kindling, and coaxing the first sparks into a steady flame. When it finally caught, the firelight made the clearing feel cozy despite the growing shadows around me. That night, I cooked a simple meal over the fire, my stomach grateful for the warmth and sustenance. I kept the fire small, careful not to attract attention from anything I didn't want to see. Afterward, I lay back on my sleeping pad inside the tent, listening to the forest around me. There were noises I didn't recognize, branches snapping in the distance, a rustling that might have been an animal, the occasional bird calling even late into the evening. I told myself it was all normal, part of the wilderness, but I couldn't shake a small sense of unease that settled deep in my chest. Sleep came slowly. Every small sound seemed louder than it should, echoing through the thin walls of the tent. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of twigs snapping close to my campsite. My heart jumped. I lay perfectly still, straining to hear, my breath shallow. The sound stopped after a moment, but my imagination ran wild. I thought about bears, cougars, or even other people. None of the possibilities were comforting. I reached for my flashlight and shone it through the tent fabric, but saw nothing. By dawn, I was exhausted but awake, unable to shake the tension from the night. I stepped out of the tent, grateful for the weak light that filtered through the trees, and immediately noticed something. My firewood pile had been disturbed. A few sticks were moved, broken in places, and the small patch of trampled ground suggested that something or someone had been near my camp. I told myself it was probably an animal, a raccoon or a deer, but the thought didn't settle my nerves. I decided to pack up and move a little farther down the trail. As I hiked, the forest felt denser, darker, and the silence seemed heavier. I kept my eyes open constantly, scanning for movement, listening to every small sound. Around midday, I found a second clearing near another stream. This one was narrower, more hidden, and I thought it would be safer. I set up my tent again and made a quick lunch. The tension never fully left me, though. I felt like I was being watched, though every time I stopped and looked around, the forest appeared empty. That night, the unease returned with a vengeance. The first fire I tried to light refused to catch. The kindling was damp despite my careful gathering, and I spent nearly an hour coaxing the flames before I finally had a small, steady fire. It wasn't enough to illuminate the clearing fully, but it was something. Around 11 p.m., I heard it again. Twigs snapping, leaves crunching under weight, something moving just beyond the reach of my firelight. I froze. The sound was deliberate this time, coming closer, circling the fire. My mind raced through every possible scenario. I didn't have a weapon, nothing more than a small pocket knife. My phone had no signal, so calling for help was impossible. Every rational thought told me to stay calm, stay quiet, and hope whoever or whatever was out there didn't notice me. I tried to focus on breathing slowly, keeping my body still, but every instinct screamed to run. After what felt like hours, the noises receded. The forest became silent again. I didn't sleep much after that, instead lying awake in the tent, listening to every rustle and snap with growing anxiety. I kept a flashlight close, my hand resting on my knife, my eyes darting around in the small circle of firelight that reached the edges of the clearing. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed up quickly, leaving the fire smoldering just enough to prevent sparks from spreading, and started the hike back to the trailhead. Every step was cautious, my pace quick but deliberate, scanning the trees and underbrush for signs of movement. Around midday, I spotted fresh tracks in the dirt, boot prints, much larger than mine. They seemed to follow the path I had taken the night before. My stomach dropped. Someone had been following me, staying hidden in the forest, moving silently. I picked up my pace, moving faster than I had intended, ignoring the soreness in my legs and the weight of my pack. The trail twisted through thick stands of trees, over rocks, and across shallow streams. Every sound, branches snapping, leaves rustling, the distant call of a bird, made me jump. I had a clear sense of being hunted, though I knew that if anyone really intended to harm me, they could have done it already. Still, the idea of being stalked through a forest where no one could hear me was terrifying. By late afternoon, I finally saw the clearing where I had left my car. Relief hit me hard, almost overwhelming me. I sprinted the last few meters, my legs burning, my heart racing. I loaded my gear quickly, fumbling with the car doors, glancing around constantly. When I finally locked myself inside and started the engine, the tension began to drain from my body, replaced by exhaustion and lingering adrenaline. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. I found a diner, ordered a coffee, and just sat for a long while, trying to let my nerves calm. The memory of the second night stayed vivid, the feeling of being watched, the deliberate noises, the tracks in the dirt, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it had been hunters, maybe someone camping nearby, maybe even just my imagination running wild in a stressful, isolated environment. Whatever it was, I had escaped. In the following days, I reported what I had seen at the local ranger station. They took my statement seriously, noting that the area had experienced a few cases of illegal hunting and trespassing recently. I realized I had been lucky. The forest was full of people, some harmless, some not, and being unprepared for that could have been dangerous. Weeks later, I went back to the city, exhausted but alive, with a new respect for the wilderness and the unpredictability of human behavior. I still loved camping and hiking, but I approached it differently now, with more caution, better preparation, and a heightened awareness of my surroundings. The memory of being watched in that quiet, dark forest never left me, but neither did the sense of survival, the clarity of having faced a real, immediate danger, and the relief of making it out safely. I learned that nature itself is not always the scariest part of camping. Sometimes the danger comes from other people, from being isolated and vulnerable, from the unknown in a place where help is far away. I survived not because of skill alone, but because I stayed calm, stayed aware, and left before the situation could escalate. That experience changed the way I approached the outdoors forever, but it didn't stop me from returning. It only made me more cautious, more respectful, and more prepared for whatever might come next. I still think about those nights sometimes, lying in the tent as the sounds of movement surrounded me, feeling eyes on me, unsure if it was animal or human. It's a memory that makes my skin crawl, but it also reminds me of my resilience, my ability to stay focused under pressure, and my luck in escaping without harm. Camping will never feel the same, but I understand now that the real terror isn't in the dark trees or the wild animals. It's in the silence, the isolation, and the uncertainty of what might be lurking just out of sight. And that lesson, learned in the cold, dark forest, stayed with me for years afterward. I never underestimate the wilderness, and I never underestimate other people, no matter how peaceful the setting appears. I survived because I respected both. I had been planning this trip for months, the kind of trip that demands careful preparation and respect for the wilderness. I was going to a remote part of the national forest, far from roads and cell service, where most people never ventured. I wanted isolation, the kind of silence that only comes from being deep in the woods. I wanted to test myself, to see if I could handle being completely alone with nothing but my gear and instincts. I had packed meticulously. A 4-season tent, sleeping bag rated for low temperatures, extra layers of clothing, food for 10 days, a water filter, first aid supplies, a small stove, and a heavy-duty knife. I even brought a compact fishing kit in case I ran low on food. Everything was planned, except for the part that no map or preparation could fully cover: the unpredictability of the forest and its unseen inhabitants. I arrived at the trailhead late in the morning, my car loaded with supplies. The sun was high, and the air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I double-checked my pack, ensured my GPS and compass were ready, and began the hike. The trail started easy, a gentle incline through towering pines, the forest floor covered with thick layers of needles that muffled my footsteps. Birds chirped above me, and every so often, I could hear the faint rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. I felt a sense of calm, even excitement. This was what I had come for. The peace of being completely removed from civilization, surrounded only by the rawness of nature. Hours passed, and the trail became steeper. I navigated rocky sections, crossed shallow streams, and pushed through areas where the undergrowth had overtaken the path. Each time I paused to catch my breath, I reminded myself to conserve energy, knowing I had a long day ahead. By mid-afternoon, I reached a plateau with a view of a wide valley below. The sight was breathtaking. Rolling hills covered in dense forest, rivers weaving through like silver ribbons, all bathed in golden light. I took a moment to rest, eat a quick snack, and drink some water. Then I checked my map and GPS. My planned campsite was still a few hours away. I adjusted my pack, squared my shoulders, and pressed on. The sun began its slow descent as I moved deeper into the forest. The temperature dropped slightly, and shadows lengthened between the trees. I started to notice small details: the crunch of dried leaves underfoot, the occasional distant call of a hawk, the faint but unmistakable smell of wet earth and decaying wood. There was beauty in the solitude, but also a growing awareness of being completely alone. Not alone in a comforting sense, but truly alone, in a place where help would be impossible if something went wrong. Around mid-evening, I found the clearing I had targeted for my campsite. It was small but flat, surrounded by dense pine on 3 sides, offering both shelter from wind and a sense of isolation. I set up my tent carefully, driving stakes into the ground, and made sure everything was secure. I collected firewood nearby, dry branches and fallen logs that would burn easily. I knew that the first night would be crucial. The fire would provide warmth, a sense of security, and light to keep animals away. By the time the fire roared, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the forest bathed in twilight. The first chill of night set in, sharp against my exposed skin as I worked. I cooked a simple meal on my portable stove, rice and canned beans with a little seasoning. The smell was comforting, reminding me of home, even in this remote wilderness. After eating, I sat by the fire, letting the warmth sink into my bones, watching the flames flicker. The forest around me was dark, almost impossibly so once the firelight failed to reach the edges of the clearing. I felt a mixture of awe and unease. Everything was normal, yet the isolation made ordinary sounds, the rustle of leaves, the snapping of twigs, feel amplified. My mind was aware of the smallest details, every creak and whisper in the darkness, every shift in wind, every distant sound of an animal moving unseen. As the night deepened, I decided to sleep early. I extinguished the fire to avoid attracting any animals and crawled into my tent, carefully closing the zipper. The first night was restless. Every sound outside my tent seemed magnified. The wind shifting the branches, small creatures scuttling over dry leaves, the occasional distant call of an owl. I told myself these were all normal forest sounds, but the darkness and solitude made them feel threatening. I lay awake for hours, listening and alert, feeling the weight of being completely isolated. Eventually, exhaustion overcame my anxiety, and I fell into an uneasy sleep. I woke before dawn, cold but alert. My body was stiff from the hard ground beneath my sleeping pad. I built a small fire, enough to warm myself and make tea. As the first rays of sun filtered through the trees, I could see dew covering the forest floor, the air crisp and fresh. I felt a brief moment of relief. The forest, though ominous at night, looked almost welcoming in daylight. I ate a small breakfast, packed up the campsite, and continued on my planned route. My goal was to reach a larger clearing near a lake that I had read about in guidebooks. It would provide a safer, more comfortable base for the rest of my journey. The hike that day was harder than I anticipated. The terrain was steep and uneven. Loose rocks made footing treacherous, and fallen logs forced detours through thick undergrowth. My legs ached, and sweat soaked through my clothes despite the cool air. I stopped often to rest and drink water. As the day progressed, I noticed subtle signs that I was not alone in the forest. Fresh animal tracks, deer, possibly bear, crisscrossed the path. The sounds of birds were fewer, replaced by the occasional distant thud of something moving in the underbrush. I remained vigilant, conscious of the possibility of encountering a wild animal, knowing that any mistake could be dangerous. The forest was beautiful, yes, but it was also unforgiving. It did not care about me, my plans, or my presence. By late afternoon, I spotted the lake in the distance, its surface shimmering under the sun. Relief surged through me. The final stretch would be easier, I thought. I moved faster, navigating a narrow path along the ridgeline. Then I noticed it, a fallen tree partially blocking the trail. As I stepped closer to climb over it, my foot slipped on the wet moss, and I tumbled down a short slope, hitting rocks on the way. Pain shot through my ankle, sharp and immediate. I tried to stand, but the weight on my ankle was unbearable. I realized I had likely sprained or broken it. Panic rose, but I forced myself to breathe deeply. I was in the middle of nowhere, unable to call for help. Every second counted, and I had to think clearly. I examined my ankle. Swelling was immediate. I knew I could not put weight on it. I remembered techniques I had learned for emergencies. Immobilize the joint, elevate if possible, and keep moving carefully to a safe spot. I tore some fabric from my shirt to make a crude bandage, wrapped my ankle tightly, and tried to move slowly. Pain shot through me with every step. The sun was low, and I knew I had limited daylight to reach the lake or find a flat area to spend the night. I rested frequently, leaning on my hiking pole and scanning the area for hazards. The forest felt different now, more threatening. Each shadow and noise a reminder of my vulnerability. I was no longer hiking leisurely. I was surviving. Eventually, I reached a small flat area with a few rocks and a patch of dry ground. It was not ideal, but it would have to do. I set up my tent, painfully slow, securing it as best I could with one good leg and one immobilized ankle. I managed to light a small fire using dry sticks and pine needles I collected nearby. The warmth was a comfort, though I had to stay alert to keep the fire going. Night fell again, colder and darker than the first. I huddled in my sleeping bag, using every layer I had to keep warm, aware that any animal attracted by the smell of my food could be dangerous. Hunger gnawed at me, but I knew it was more important to preserve my energy and warmth. The night was long and exhausting. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the underbrush, made my heart pound. I imagined a bear, or worse, a pack of wolves, drawn by the scent of my fire or my movement. I reminded myself that most wildlife would avoid humans, but the isolation made the imagination run wild. I stayed awake much of the night, listening, adjusting my bandage, and ensuring the fire did not die. Dawn felt like salvation, a promise that I had survived the worst of the darkness. I ate a little food, sipped water, and planned my next move. The morning was slow. My ankle was swollen and stiff, but the daylight gave me some confidence. I knew I could not stay there indefinitely. I had to reach safety, even if it meant crawling part of the way. I started moving carefully, one step at a time, using my hiking pole for balance. Hours passed. Pain was constant, my body exhausted, but I kept going. I followed landmarks from the map and GPS, navigating by ridgelines and streams. Every decision mattered. One wrong step could lead to a fall or worse. By late afternoon, I finally saw a familiar trail junction. Relief washed over me. I knew this trail would lead eventually to a ranger station and then back to civilization. I pushed on, ignoring the pain, adrenaline and determination driving me forward. When I finally emerged from the forest onto the dirt road, my legs trembling and my ankle throbbing, I felt a profound sense of relief. I limped along the road until I reached the ranger station. The rangers helped me, cleaned and bandaged my ankle properly, and arranged transport back to town. I was safe. I had survived. Looking back, I realized how fragile my situation had been. A few more hours in the wrong place, a slip in the wrong direction, and it could have ended very differently. The forest had tested me, not with ghosts or fairies, but with real danger. Isolation, injury, and the unpredictability of nature. I had faced it, made careful decisions, and survived through resilience, patience, and a measure of luck. That trip left me with deep respect for the wilderness, for its beauty, its challenges, and its merciless reality. I would return one day, but never unprepared, never underestimating the forest, and never forgetting how easily safety can be lost. It had been a long week, the kind that leaves your shoulders tight and your head buzzing. I decided a solo camping trip would be the perfect way to unwind, to shake off the stress and the constant noise of the city. I packed my car with everything I thought I might need: tent, sleeping bag, stove, enough food for a week, water, a first aid kit, extra batteries, and a small handheld flashlight. I even packed a couple of books, though I knew the likelihood of reading them was low. I wanted nothing but silence and the steady rhythm of nature. I drove for hours, leaving the last traces of the city behind, taking back roads that twisted through hills and patches of forest. The GPS was set for a remote state park I had never visited before, a place known for hiking trails and primitive campsites. I didn't want the type of camping where other people were within shouting distance. I wanted isolation, the kind that leaves you acutely aware of every sound and every shift in the wind. The park was bigger than I expected. By the time I found a trailhead that led to one of the more secluded camping spots, the sun was already dipping toward the horizon. The air was cooler than I expected, the kind of cool that carries the sharp scent of pine and earth. I parked my car at the trailhead and unloaded my pack, the weight of it steady against my back as I started down the narrow dirt path. The forest seemed to grow denser with every step. Trees leaned over the trail, their branches forming jagged shadows on the ground that made it feel like the woods themselves were closing in on me. I reached the clearing I had marked on the map just as the last light of day bled out across the horizon. The clearing was small, barely enough for a tent and a fire pit, and it was ringed with tall pine trees that rose like silent sentinels. The ground was uneven, covered in roots and fallen pine needles. I set up my tent slowly, methodically, making sure the stakes were secure and the rain flap was tied down, though the sky was clear. The smell of damp earth rose from the soil as I worked, rich and heavy, almost sweet. By the time the tent was up, darkness had fallen. I started a small fire, the kind you have to coax into life with patience and dry twigs. The flames licked upward, small but bright against the encroaching night. I ate a quick dinner of canned beans and bread, savoring the simple satisfaction of warmth and food. Then I sat back, leaning against my pack, and let my senses settle into the forest. First, it was peaceful. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and moss. Insects chirped quietly, and somewhere in the distance, the call of an owl echoed. I felt detached from time, the city, everything. My heartbeat slowed as I let my eyes adjust to the darkness, the fire casting shadows that danced across the clearing. But slowly, subtly, I noticed the small sounds of the forest change. A twig snapped somewhere behind the ring of trees. I froze. At first, I told myself it was an animal, probably a deer or a raccoon, but the snap was followed by another, then another, irregular and uneven. I strained my eyes, scanning the darkness outside the firelight, but I couldn't see anything. My ears picked up more, the soft brush of movement through the leaves, the shifting of undergrowth. It was close, but not immediately at the edge of the clearing. I reminded myself to stay calm. I had packed a flashlight for situations like this. I reached for it, the metal cool against my fingers, and switched it on. The beam cut through the black, illuminating the trunks of the trees and the forest floor in stark white light. Nothing. The forest seemed to hold its breath, and then I realized the sound had stopped. I tried to shake it off. Animals move at night. Maybe it was a bear, maybe it was just a deer, but the uneasy feeling lingered, crawling up the back of my neck. I kept the fire going longer than usual, adding more wood, the flames cracking and hissing as they consumed the dry sticks. The light of the fire seemed to push back the darkness, but it also cast grotesque shadows from the trees, shadows that twisted and reached toward me as the flames danced. I went to bed with the flashlight on, positioned so I could grab it immediately. Sleep didn't come easily. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the call of a distant bird, the shifting of branches, made me startle. Hours passed in fits and starts, and just as I was finally drifting towards sleep, I heard it again. A low, deliberate snapping of twigs, much closer this time. My body stiffened. I could hear breathing, or at least it sounded like heavy breathing, coming from somewhere just beyond the firelight. I tried to tell myself it was a deer or some other animal, but instinct told me otherwise. The sound was too irregular, too deliberate. It was moving, pacing almost around the edge of the clearing. I grabbed my flashlight and swung it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, catching glimpses of movement. Nothing concrete, just shadows shifting in the trees. My stomach knotted. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt warped. Every small noise kept me on edge, and I found myself listening for patterns, for anything that would explain the sounds. I could hear faint scrapes along the underbrush, the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. The wind shifted, carrying a new scent, something metallic, sharp. My pulse raced. I had packed a small folding knife in my tent, and I gripped it tightly, feeling the cold metal against my palm. Sleep finally came in brief bursts, always interrupted by the forest. I would jerk awake at every rustle, every snap. The sounds weren't consistent. They moved closer, then farther, never fully showing themselves. It was maddening. I spent the night like this, tense and alert, listening to the forest around me as though I were in a living trap. By morning, exhaustion had set in. My body ached from tension and lack of sleep. I decided to take a walk, to let myself see the surroundings in daylight. The forest, in the clear light of morning, looked much less threatening. Sunlight filtered through the branches, dust motes floating lazily in the beams. Birds sang. The air was still cool, but warmer than the night. I walked the perimeter of the clearing carefully, looking for tracks or signs of animals. That's when I noticed something odd. Footprints. They were not deer tracks, not raccoon tracks. They were larger, human, and they circled the clearing. Close to the edge, hidden among the roots and undergrowth, there were prints that hadn't been there the day before, or at least I hadn't noticed them. They were deep, indicating a heavy weight, and they weren't consistent with hiking boots I had seen. They looked older, worn, and irregular. My stomach turned. Whoever had left them had been moving around the clearing while I slept. Panic rose, but I forced myself to think. I couldn't stay there, not knowing who or what was nearby. I packed up my tent quickly, making as little noise as possible. The prints crunched under my feet as I moved through the forest toward the trailhead. My heart thumped, a dull ache in my chest as adrenaline sharpened every sound. I kept my knife ready, flashlight in hand, scanning constantly for movement. As I reached the trail, I thought I was safe. I could see my car parked in the small clearing at the trailhead. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. There, on the ground in front of the car, were more footprints. These ones were fresh, leading away from the woods and toward the road. But their path curved, almost as if someone was following me, waiting. My mind raced. I checked the back seat and the interior of the car quickly. Nothing, but the sense of being watched persisted. I got into the car and locked the doors. My hands shook on the steering wheel. I started the engine and kept it idling for several minutes, staring into the forest. The undergrowth moved. I could swear I saw shadows flitting among the trees. I forced myself to take a deep breath and remember why I was there. Survival, calm, focus. I backed out slowly and started driving down the road. The drive back was tense, every turn, every curve in the road making me jump. I kept the headlights on high beam, scanning the edges of the forest. Nothing followed. The quiet of the morning seemed peaceful compared to the tension of the night, but my nerves were raw. I didn't stop until I reached the first gas station outside the park. I bought water, some food, anything that would give me a moment to feel normal again. I called my office just to have someone else on the line, even briefly. I learned later, after reporting the incident to park authorities, that the area I had camped in was known for transient individuals, people who sometimes set up in the woods, moving quietly, rarely seen, but leaving traces and occasionally disturbing campers. No one was harmed, no one intended to, but the footprints, the pacing, the sounds, all were part of someone living off the grid, invisible yet present. It explained the irregular movements, the heavy breathing at night, the feeling of being watched. It didn't make the night any less terrifying, but it did make sense. I never returned to that forest. I still hike, still camp, but I am always aware of my surroundings, always mindful of the sounds, the signs, the tracks. Nature is beautiful, yes, but it is also vast, indifferent, and in certain places, unpredictable. That trip taught me that preparation is only half of it. The other half is awareness, patience, and respect for the unknown, the people and the wildlife who share the space with you. I still remember the smell of the pine and earth, the way shadows seemed to reach into the clearing, the way each snap of a twig made my heart leap. I remember the exhaustion, the fear, and the relief of finally leaving. And though the memory is sharp, precise, and unnerving, it is also clear. I survived, I learned, and I carry that lesson with me every time I step into the wilderness. I had always loved the idea of being alone in the wilderness. There was something about the quiet, the smell of pine needles, the rough textures of the forest floor, and the way the sunlight filtered through the trees that made me feel alive in a way that the city never could. I had gone on shorter camping trips before, but this one was meant to be different. I wanted to truly push myself, spend a full week alone in a national forest hundreds of miles from the nearest town, with only my backpack, my tent, and the knowledge that I could handle whatever came my way. I had spent months preparing, studying maps, checking weather reports, packing food and water, and making sure my small first aid kit was complete. I felt confident, almost too confident, like I could take on anything nature had to throw at me. The first 2 days went almost exactly as I expected. The hike to the clearing where I wanted to set up camp was long but not overly difficult. The terrain was rugged, full of steep inclines and dense underbrush, but I moved at a steady pace, careful not to overexert myself. I carried my backpack, heavy with food, a stove and supplies, and though my shoulders ached by the time I reached the clearing, I felt satisfied. I set up my tent on a small flat area surrounded by tall trees, giving me some shelter from the wind, but also enough visibility to see any wildlife approaching. I had a small fire pit cleared out, and I spent the evening cooking a simple meal of rice and canned beans, watching as the firelight danced across the trees and listening to the wind sigh through the branches. The first night was quiet. No animals wandered close enough to make me uneasy, and no unusual sounds came from the forest. The moon was bright, almost full, and I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the natural symphony of the forest. The rustle of leaves, the occasional crack of a branch, the distant call of an owl. I slept lightly, half in awe of the forest and half alert to any unexpected sound. By the morning, I felt energized, ready to explore further and gather firewood for the next few days. Day 3 started normally. I decided to hike a little deeper into the forest to see a small stream marked on my map. The path was overgrown, and I had to carefully pick my way through thick brush and tangled roots. My boots slipped several times on loose soil and fallen leaves, but I managed without injury. The forest seemed calm, almost serene, and I let my guard down, thinking I had already proven myself capable of handling this environment. When I reached the stream, I paused to rest, sitting on a mossy log and watching the water flow over smooth stones. I refilled my water bottles and took a moment to breathe in the smell of wet earth and fresh water. That evening, I returned to my camp without issue. I was tired but satisfied, feeling the kind of deep exhaustion that comes from physical exertion combined with the mental focus of navigating a wild environment. I cooked a simple dinner again, ate slowly, and watched the fire burn down to embers before crawling into my sleeping bag. It was during the night on day 3 that the first real unease settled over me. I woke to a strange sound outside the tent, something that didn't belong to the forest. At first, I thought it might be a deer or a raccoon, perhaps something knocking over a branch or foraging. But the sound was too deliberate, too heavy, like someone or something was moving with purpose. My stomach tightened as I pressed my ear against the tent wall. There it was again, a series of slow, careful steps moving in a circle around my campsite. I stayed still, heart hammering. I knew that the forest was full of animals, but something about this felt different. The rhythm of the steps, the weight behind them, suggested something larger than a deer or a raccoon. I reached for my flashlight and quietly zipped open the tent, careful not to make a sound. The beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the clearing, but there was nothing there. I scanned the perimeter again and again, my hands shaking slightly, but the steps had stopped. Sleep came only fitfully that night. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me sit up, tense and alert. I kept the knife I had brought on the sleeping bag beside me, just in case. The fear wasn't overwhelming, but it was there, a constant awareness that I was alone in a vast forest, and that I could be entirely vulnerable. The next day, I tried to shake off the fear. I reminded myself that the wilderness was full of noises and that most were harmless. I gathered more firewood, checked my supplies, and made sure my water was sufficient for the coming days. As I walked through the trees, however, I noticed something else. signs that someone else had been in the area recently. There were footprints in the mud near the stream, some small, some larger, none of them mine. I recognized the pattern of boots, the kind that hikers or hunters might wear, but it was strange. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail, and this was a remote area. The footprints weren't old. The mud was still soft enough that they could only have been made that morning, or perhaps the night before. A cold chill ran down my spine as I followed the footprints back toward my campsite. There was a part of me that wanted to turn around and hike back to the trailhead immediately, but another part, the part that had always felt a strange pride in testing myself, urged me to stay. I told myself I was being cautious, not reckless. I made a mental note to keep my fire going through the night and to stay alert. The following nights were the worst. The sounds I had heard on the third night returned, more insistent now. Something moved outside the tent almost every night, circling closer than before. I could hear the crunch of leaves, the snap of branches under heavy boots, and sometimes even the faint murmur of movement. Someone breathing too heavily, perhaps, or adjusting their weight. I kept my fire burning as long as I could, but fuel was limited. I tried to make noise during the day, banging sticks together, marking trees, trying to make my presence obvious. Still, the feeling of being watched never left. On the fourth day, I made a decision. I couldn't stay in the clearing any longer. I packed up camp in the early morning, moving quietly and deliberately so as not to draw attention. I chose a different path through the forest, one that would take me along a ridge and hopefully toward a secondary trail I had marked on my map. The hike was exhausting. The forest was dense, the air thick and heavy, and the ground slippery with damp leaves. My pack felt heavier than ever, every step a reminder of how physically vulnerable I was. By late afternoon, I reached a small ridge overlooking a valley. The view was breathtaking. A river snaking through the trees, sunlight glinting off the water, mist rising from the forest floor. I paused, trying to calm my mind, knowing I needed to make a plan. I considered camping there for the night, but my instincts screamed at me not to stop. The sense of being watched had grown stronger, more focused, and I didn't want to risk being trapped. I continued along the ridge, moving cautiously, eyes scanning constantly. As the sun began to set, shadows lengthened, and the forest took on an ominous quality. I realized that I had been so focused on avoiding danger that I hadn't noticed how quickly the day was slipping away. I needed to find a safe place to sleep before darkness fully descended. Eventually, I found a small clearing, not ideal but sufficient. I set up my tent quickly, keeping it as low profile as possible, and started a small fire to provide warmth and a sense of security. I ate a small portion of my remaining food, knowing I needed to conserve energy. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, watching, waiting. The night was the worst yet. I heard footsteps again, slow and deliberate, circling the clearing. This time, I wasn't sure if they were human. The steps were too heavy for an animal but too soft for someone wearing regular boots. I gripped my knife and flashlight, lying awake, straining to hear the slightest change. I watched the tent walls, imagining shadows moving just beyond the fabric. Hours passed, and the fire dwindled, leaving me shivering in the cold. When dawn finally came, I dared to unzip the tent. The clearing was empty, and the forest beyond seemed almost peaceful in the morning light. I packed up as quickly as I could, my hands shaking, and began the descent toward the secondary trail. The hike was exhausting, but I forced myself to keep moving, taking deliberate steps and constantly checking my surroundings. It was late afternoon when I finally stumbled onto the trail. Relief washed over me as I saw the faint markings of hikers who had passed before. I followed the trail, moving steadily, until I reached a small parking area where cars were parked. I could see people in the distance, hikers laughing, talking, completely unaware of the fear I had endured. When I finally reached my car, I collapsed in the driver's seat, exhausted, shaking, and overwhelmed with relief. I didn't feel pride anymore. I felt only gratitude for the fact that I had survived, that I had listened to my instincts, and that I was finally leaving the forest behind. The experience had been terrifying, yes, but it had also reminded me of something essential. Nature was beautiful, but it was also indifferent and unforgiving. Survival required vigilance, respect, and humility. I drove away slowly, still checking the rearview mirror, still expecting something to follow. But nothing did. The forest receded behind me, silent, vast, and unknowable. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I bought food, water, and finally a shower. I slept for hours that night, every muscle in my body aching, every thought haunted by the nights I had spent listening to the forest and the heavy footsteps outside my tent. In the weeks afterward, I thought a lot about what had happened. The experience left scars, not physical ones, but mental ones. I understood now the true weight of isolation, the fragility of human life in the wild, and the way fear could sharpen every sense, every instinct. I never went back to that forest, and I never attempted a solo camping trip of that length again. But I also carried a strange pride with me, the knowledge that I had survived something frightening and unpredictable, relying only on my wits, preparation, and the refusal to give in to panic. It stayed with me, a constant reminder that the wilderness was not a playground, that safety could never be taken for granted, and that the line between calm and terror was thinner than I had ever imagined. I had planned this camping trip for months, obsessively checking maps, weather reports, and survival forums. I wanted a place far from people, deep into the forest where the trees were thick and the trails were seldom used. I needed solitude, a break from the city, from constant noise and light and the suffocating rhythm of other people's lives. I packed carefully, taking only what I could carry on my back. A large hiking backpack, a tent, sleeping bag, stove, water filter, food for 5 days, a knife, first aid, and extra clothes. I double-checked everything twice before leaving, not wanting to regret leaving anything behind once I was out there. The drive to the trailhead took most of the day. The roads narrowed and twisted, flanked by steep banks and thick forest. By the time I arrived, the sun was low, painting the horizon with streaks of orange and pink. I parked my car and stepped onto the trail. Immediately, the sounds of the city fell away. I could hear only the whisper of wind through the branches, the occasional distant bird call, and the crunch of my boots on the dirt path. The first day was uneventful but tiring. The trail was uneven and steep in places, covered in loose rocks and roots. I drank water regularly and paused often to rest, noticing the small details around me. The different shades of green in the moss, the patterns of bark on old pine trees, the faint smell of damp earth mixed with pine sap. I felt a quiet excitement in being completely alone, surrounded by wilderness, with only my own senses to navigate. By late afternoon, I decided to make camp. I found a small clearing near a creek, flat enough to pitch my tent, with enough space to safely build a fire a few meters away. The creek murmured softly, and the sun glinted off its surface. I gathered firewood, trying to find dry sticks and small branches, careful not to take anything too close to the creek banks, which were damp and unsafe. The first fire went up easily, flickering orange in the growing shadows. I boiled water and ate a simple dinner of rice and beans, washing it down with water from the creek that I filtered carefully. Night fell quickly in the forest. By the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, it was pitch black. The sounds of the forest grew louder. Insects buzzing, the occasional snap of a twig somewhere in the distance, the soft rustle of leaves as something large moved far off. I told myself it was nothing, that it was normal, but I couldn't help feeling my body tense every time I heard a louder crack of a branch. I tried to sleep, but I kept listening, half expecting some animal to step into the clearing, or worse. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a shallow sleep. The next day, I planned to follow the creek upstream. I wanted to see if it led to a better campsite or even a small waterfall I had read about on the hiking forums. The morning was crisp and clear, with dew still clinging to the leaves. I packed up carefully, making sure no trace of my previous night remained, and headed along the creek. The terrain was steeper than I had anticipated. Loose rocks and mud made footing tricky. My boots slipped more than once, sending me scrambling to catch myself. I realized that being alert at every step was exhausting, but necessary. As the day wore on, I became aware of something subtle but disquieting. I wasn't alone. At first, it was just a sense of being watched. I'd stop for a break, and the forest would feel heavier, as if someone or something was just out of sight, observing me. I kept telling myself it was paranoia, that no one else would be out here in this remote section, especially in midweek. But then I noticed footprints. Not human footprints exactly, but impressions in the mud that suggested someone or something had passed this way recently. They weren't clear, and the mud was soft enough to distort them, but it was enough to make my stomach tighten. By mid-afternoon, I reached a small plateau above the creek. I could see the trail continuing along a narrow ledge, with the forest dense below. I stopped to rest and eat some trail mix, looking carefully at the surroundings. That's when I heard it. A voice. Not talking, not yelling, but a low, deliberate rustle, like someone moving through the undergrowth, keeping low. My heart jumped. I froze, straining to see. The forest was thick, but movement shifted in my peripheral vision. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer, but it didn't move like a deer. It moved purposefully. I packed up quickly, taking the high path along the ledge, hoping to put distance between myself and whatever was down there. The forest seemed to close in, every shadow stretching unnaturally. I felt exposed on the ledge, but also safer being out of the lower undergrowth. By evening, I found a small area where I could pitch my tent, though it wasn't ideal. There were no large, flat rocks, and the soil was uneven. I tried to settle, but sleep didn't come easily. Every crack and snap in the forest kept me awake. I double-checked that my knife and small flashlight were within reach. The creek sounded distant now, but the wind made the trees moan in ways that seemed to echo with intent. Night was worse than I imagined. I heard footsteps around my campsite. At first, it was sporadic, then rhythmic, deliberate. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound stopped when I turned my flashlight toward the edge of the clearing, but the feeling of being watched didn't. I lay frozen for hours, mentally running through what I could do if someone approached. I had my knife, yes, but I wasn't trained for confrontations. I thought about my phone, but I had no signal. I thought about shouting, but that would announce my position. Eventually, I realized I had no choice but to stay put, hoping whoever or whatever it was would leave. I tried to focus on breathing, on slowing my pulse, on convincing myself that I was alone. By the time dawn broke, I was drained. My eyes were raw from staring into the darkness, and my muscles ached from tension. The forest had gone silent again, at least for the moment. I decided not to stay another night in that spot. I packed hastily, scanning the perimeter constantly, moving as quickly and quietly as possible. I followed a ridge I hadn't noticed before, hoping it would lead back toward a more populated trail. The hike was grueling. My legs burned, and the terrain was rough with fallen trees and loose soil. I had to climb over rocks and push through thick underbrush. I kept looking back, half expecting to see someone following, but no one appeared. Still, the fear lingered, a tight knot in my stomach that refused to loosen. Around midday, I found a familiar marker I had noted on my map, a fork in the trail near an abandoned logging road. Relief surged through me. I knew if I followed the logging road, I could reach a small ranger station I had read about, or at least a main trail with other hikers. The road was rough but passable. I walked quickly, alert for any sign of movement. Hours passed, and the sun began to sink. The logging road twisted through dense forest, sometimes steep, sometimes flat. My water supply was low, and I rationed carefully, sipping slowly to avoid dehydration. I was exhausted but felt a glimmer of hope. Finally, as twilight approached, I saw a sign indicating a trail junction leading to the ranger station. My pace quickened, and I felt a sense of cautious optimism. When I emerged onto the main trail, I spotted a hiker with a backpack heading in the opposite direction. Seeing another person, fully human and alive, was a relief so profound it almost made me cry. I waved, though I didn't want to stop to talk. I just needed to know there were other humans nearby. I reached the ranger station shortly after. The building was small and functional, with a radio and supplies for emergencies. I explained briefly what happened, careful not to embellish, only to ensure the park rangers were aware of the possibility that someone else had been in the remote forest without proper clearance or intent. They nodded, took my statement, and provided water, food, and a place to rest. I sat for hours, letting the tension drain from my body, feeling the reality of my ordeal sink in. In the following days, I returned to the trail only once, with a ranger accompanying me, to pinpoint where I had camped and where I suspected someone else had been. We found evidence of human presence. A few abandoned items, footprints, and the faint signs of a fire. It was enough to understand that someone had been nearby, someone who might have been watching, perhaps with intent to scare or follow. But there was no confrontation, no crime scene, just the lingering reality that in the wilderness, you are never as alone as you think. That experience stayed with me long after I returned home. I relived every step, every sound, every shadow in the forest. I realized that camping, no matter how carefully planned, carries risks beyond weather or wildlife. Human presence can be just as unpredictable and dangerous. I also learned to respect my instincts, to recognize when fear is a warning rather than imagination, and to trust my preparation and awareness above all else. Months later, I went back into the wilderness, but never that remote, never alone. I carried more than my backpack, walkie-talkies, extra rations, a GPS device, and always someone else. The forest remained beautiful, the creek still sparkling, the trees standing tall and quiet, but I carried with me a new understanding. The forest is indifferent, and the human element unpredictable. I learned to navigate both, and I survived because I stayed alert, cautious, and never underestimated the power of fear grounded in reality. I had always loved the quiet of the woods, the way the wind moved through the trees, the smell of damp earth after a rain, the sound of birds and insects creating an endless, natural rhythm. That's why, when I finally got a long weekend off, I decided to go camping alone in a remote area I had been curious about for months. The place wasn't famous, not on any of the popular camping sites lists. It was a patch of forest that I had stumbled across while hiking months earlier, a place where a small creek cut through thick pine and oak, and the land sloped up into rocky ridges that offered a perfect view of the surrounding hills. I wanted isolation, and I thought it would be peaceful, just me and nature. I didn't realize that the isolation could be dangerous. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sky was a dull gray, thick clouds moving fast as the wind picked up. I parked my old, beaten-up pickup at the trailhead and hoisted my pack over my shoulders. Inside the pack was everything I thought I might need. A tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, a lantern with extra batteries, enough food for 3 days, a first aid kit, water filters, and my trusty knife. I didn't bring my phone's charger. I wanted to escape the world. After all, as I stepped onto the narrow dirt trail, I noticed how quiet it was. Almost too quiet. No distant traffic, no planes overhead, only the occasional rustle of leaves. The forest felt alive in a way that made me both exhilarated and slightly uneasy. The hike in wasn't long, maybe 2 miles, but the terrain was rough. Roots snaked across the trail, fallen branches blocked my way, and the mud from the earlier rain made some parts slippery. I kept my pace slow, careful with each step. I was aware of every sound. The creak of a branch under my boot, a bird calling somewhere deep in the canopy, the whisper of the wind through the pines. Eventually, I reached the clearing I had chosen for my campsite, a small flat area near the creek. The ground was soft but firm, and I liked that I could hear the water running nearby. Perfect. I set up my tent with practiced efficiency, hammering in the stakes and threading the poles carefully. Inside, I laid out my sleeping bag, checked my gear, and then walked down to the creek to refill my water bottles and splash some cold water on my face. The air smelled fresh, wet, and earthy. I sat by the water for a while, listening to the steady rush and watching the small ripples form. As the day turned to dusk, I built a small fire using dry sticks and logs I found nearby. Fire had a strange way of making the woods feel safe, even when the shadows lengthened. I cooked a simple meal, ate slowly, and watched the light fade from the sky. The first night in the wilderness was peaceful. I went to sleep feeling content, the sound of the creek lulling me to rest. I woke early the next morning, the air cold and crisp. Mist hung low over the creek, swirling like smoke through the trees. I made breakfast and packed a day pack with a few essentials. Water, a small first aid kit, and my knife. I wanted to explore the ridge above the campsite. The climb was steeper than I expected. Rocks jutted out at sharp angles, and the ground was slick from overnight dew. I moved carefully, testing each step before committing my weight. After an hour, I reached a small outcrop that offered a view of the surrounding valley. The forest stretched endlessly, and I felt a profound sense of solitude. I took pictures, drank water, and then started my descent. As I was climbing down, I noticed the weather was changing. The clouds had thickened, turning darker, and the wind had picked up. I thought it was just an afternoon storm brewing, but there was a peculiar heaviness to the air, a sense that something was off. By the time I returned to camp, the first drops of rain were falling, gentle at first but quickly turning into a steady drizzle. I covered my supplies, secured my tent, and built a larger fire under the canopy of trees to try and keep warm. The rain persisted, and the sound of it on the leaves was both soothing and oppressive. I readied myself for a long night. Around late afternoon, I started to notice strange noises. At first, I thought it was the wind, or perhaps small animals moving through the underbrush. But then I heard heavier sounds, like footsteps, crunching leaves, moving cautiously yet deliberately through the forest not far from my tent. My heart rate increased. I stayed still, gripping my knife, listening carefully. The sound came closer, then paused, as if whatever it was had stopped to listen in return. I told myself it was probably a deer or another large animal. Bears were known to roam these forests, but I had taken precautions. Food stored away in bear-proof containers, fire going. Still, unease settled in my stomach like a stone. The rain got heavier. Lightning flashed in the distance, followed by low rumbles of thunder. I kept my fire going, though I could feel the wind trying to push it out. It was night when the sounds returned. This time, I distinctly heard a snapping branch, then a rustle, then what I realized was the sound of heavy breathing, just at the edge of the firelight. My mind raced. I knew that some people hiked alone in the backcountry, but this area was rarely visited. It wasn't impossible someone could be there, but it felt too deliberate, too targeted. I remained still, trying to make no sound, telling myself not to panic. My knife was in my hand, my backpack close, my fire my only shield against the unknown. Hours passed. The rain never let up, turning into a drenching downpour. Each time the wind howled, the fire sputtered, and I felt more vulnerable. At some point, I realized the noises had stopped. Perhaps whoever or whatever was there had left, or perhaps they were watching, waiting. Couldn't tell. Sleep was impossible, not with my senses straining at every shadow, every gust of wind, every distant animal call. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted, trembling from lack of sleep, rain, and fear. The morning was quiet, almost eerily so. I packed quickly, trying not to waste time. As I prepared to hike out, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints in the soft mud near my tent. Large, deep prints that weren't animal prints. Human. Someone had been there overnight, moving around my tent, watching me. Panic rose in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I checked the surrounding area carefully. No one was there now, but the prints led into the forest, in a direction that could have easily cornered me if I had left earlier. I realized how lucky I had been to have stayed put. My mind raced through worst-case scenarios. I had to get out of there fast before whoever had been there returned. I started the hike out, taking a different route than I had come in, sticking to the main trail where the mud was firm and the underbrush less dense. Every sound made me flinch. The wind rustling leaves, branches snapping underfoot, even the distant call of a hawk. I kept my eyes on the trees, scanning constantly for movement. Hours passed as I navigated the forest. My energy was low, my legs sore, and my mind exhausted from tension and fear. I stopped only briefly to drink water and catch my breath, constantly listening. The prints I had seen near my campsite haunted me. Someone had been that close. I had no idea what they wanted or why they had been there. It was terrifying to imagine a stranger stalking me in such a remote place. By late afternoon, I finally saw a clearing up ahead, the trailhead where I had parked my truck. Relief flooded me. I didn't slow down, didn't linger. I reached the pickup, fumbled with the keys, and finally started the engine. The sound of it felt like a shield. I drove slowly, eyes scanning the treeline, every sense alert. I didn't want to look back, didn't want to imagine that someone might still be following. The road stretched ahead, empty and quiet, until I finally reached a paved highway. Civilization. I called the local ranger station immediately, reporting the footprints and the strange noises I had heard. They told me the area had been reported for occasional trespassers and that they would check it out. But I didn't wait around. I drove straight home. Once inside my apartment, I sat in silence for a long time. My hands still shook from the adrenaline, and I couldn't stop replaying the night over in my mind. I felt lucky to be alive, lucky that whoever had been in the woods near me had left before something terrible happened. I realized that being in nature alone was beautiful, but it came with risks I hadn't fully understood. Preparation, awareness, and caution were critical. I swore to myself that I would continue camping because I loved it, but I would never again underestimate the dangers of being completely isolated in the wilderness. And I would always let someone know exactly where I was, even if it was just a text or a note on the fridge. Solitude was valuable, but life was more valuable. Over the next few weeks, I made adjustments. I researched safer ways to store food, learned more about local wildlife, and found areas with better cell service or more frequent ranger patrols. The memory of that night stayed with me. The rain, the sounds, the footprints, but I didn't let it stop me from being outdoors. Instead, it taught me to respect the forest in every way, to respect its beauty but never to underestimate the possibility of danger, whether from the environment or from other people. Every trip after that, I carried extra safety gear, a reliable map, and always stayed alert. Nature remained my escape, but now it was an escape with caution, knowledge, and respect. That night in the woods had been terrifying, but I emerged stronger, wiser, and more aware, ready to experience the wilderness again, but never the same way I had before.